But the synapsids were sort of the dominant, even when the thoracids were around, they weren't dominant. The synapsids were the dominant initial reptilian form. Most of these were replaced by diapsids in the Triassic period, about 230 million years ago. So we sort of see this shift in evolutionary behavior between the synapsids and the diapsids. Diapsids were the ones that evolved into the reptiles that we see today primarily. So you have things like the archosaurs. These were the first bipedal reptiles. Prior to this, the synapsids were on 4 legs. The archosaurs were able to walk around on 2 legs. These archosaurs gave rise to things that we think of as the dinosaurs. They also gave rise to the lineage of birds, because birds are related to dinosaurs. Pterosaurs. People think pterosaurs are the same thing as dinosaurs, but it's a different lineage. And they also gave rise to a lineage of reptiles that's alive today, the crocodilians. So those are all sort of evolved from this archosaur ancestor. Dinosaurs, in terms of dominance on the planet, were around for a very, very long period of time. They survived for over 150 million years as the dominant life form, completely eclipsing every other life form, every other animal that was on the planet. About 65 million years ago, the vast majority of dinosaurs became extinct. The ones that didn't become extinct evolved into what we see as birds today. But we don't have any dinosaurs around today. What happened to the dinosaurs? A meteor hit the planet. There's a lot of theories about what actually happened after that. One of the most common ones is you basically had a huge dust cloud that covered the planet, cooled the temperatures down. Since the dinosaurs, this dominant life form, were ectotherms, they weren't able to regulate their own internal body temperature. They couldn't survive as the temperature cooled down. On the other hand, the birds are endotherms. They are able to regulate body temperature. The therapsids, the mammal-like reptiles that gave rise to the mammals, were able to regulate body temperature. The mammals that were around at that point were able to regulate body temperature. So that's one idea or one hypothesis as to why the dinosaurs died out. There are a few others, but that is sort of the most commonly accepted one. But the fact of the matter is, you had these organisms that were so dominant for so long, 150 million years, and then just in a blink of an eye, they were wiped out. Well, not really a blink of an eye. It took a fair length of time, but in terms of geologic time scale, it was extremely quick. Now, how many people have been following the news recently? Science news. What's something that's been in the news a lot, not related to this? The mammoth? The mammoth? The mammoth? No.
Is it the cells of the
Nope.
Didn't he on a frog?
Nope. Meteors. Didn't we just have a near miss?
Oh, yeah.
Oh, yeah. There was a near miss. I believe there was a meteor that passed in between the orbit of the Earth, moon around the Earth. So a meteor that came by that was closer than the moon. There was another one that we didn't even see that came by. It was a little bit further away, but we only got about a week's warning of it. They actually are tracking one now that's going to hit sometime next summer. They anticipate that it's actually going to be going much, much closer to Mars. But they say that it might actually hit Mars. And it's sort of interesting that all of a sudden we have a lot of these thoughts. Oh my God, what if this meteor actually hits the planet? NASA's playing it up because they want to get funding to study this. I don't blame them. But it's something to think about, that this can sort of come out of the blue. And if we're talking about things like climate change, there's nothing like a meteor hitting the planet to cause climate change. So, the modern reptiles that we see today are sort of identified, characterized by 2 important characteristics that separate them from the amphibians. One of these is internal fertilization. So we see a situation where we don't see just random internal fertilization, but rather the vast majority of the organisms within these lineages now engage in internal fertilization. The sperm fertilizes the egg before we start forming these protective membranes. Remember, we have this separation, this development of the amniotic egg that allows for a separation from water. But if you have these membranes, Sperm are not going to be able to get through that, so you need to have fertilization occur before these membranes form. This is why internal fertilization evolved, where they co-evolved with these amniotic eggs. Because if you lay the egg with these membranes, you can't have external fertilization. So you have to have this internal fertilization process. We also see an increase in an improvement in the circulatory system. We're seeing a more efficient mechanism of getting oxygen from the atmosphere, but then also a more efficient mechanism of circulating that oxygen, providing the oxygen to the different regions of the body in a more efficient, more effective mechanism. So while the amphibians engaged in cutaneous respiration, once we start dealing with reptiles and everything that evolved from reptiles, we're dealing with a system where they're only using their lungs for respiration. There's no more cutaneous respiration. You can't have wet skin to aid that process of absorption. Now, your lungs can be wet. In fact, the visceral water layer in the lungs is absolutely essential for their function. But that's an internal structure. You don't need to worry about that water evaporating as much. So one of the adaptations we see in the circulatory system is we start to see an increased separation within the heart. And reptiles have a septum in the heart that partially divides the heart into two different chambers. So we still have the atrium, we still have the ventricle, or two atrium, we still have the ventricle, but we start to see a separation of that ventricle. Now, crocodiles, birds, and mammals have a completely divided heart. They actually have 4 chambers, not the 3 that we see in other reptiles. So it's an even more efficient mechanism of circulating the blood. Other reptiles, other than the crocodiles and birds, all have a 3-chambered heart. So if we look at the circulatory system, we talked about the fish having a single circuit, a single loop. They have 1 atrium, 1 ventricle. The blood just flows in the circular pattern. It passes over the gills to become oxygenated. It then goes through the body into the capillaries in the body. The oxygen is removed. It then goes back into the atrium, ventricle, and is pumped back to the gills. But in reptiles, we start to see a separation. We start to see sort of this evolution of a dual circuit system. Reptiles, we have 2 atrium, we have 1 ventricle. The ventricle is partially divided, so when blood leaves, some blood is going to enter the lungs and become oxygenated. That's represented as red. That will then move back to the heart, into the ventricle, and be pumped back out. And so this is where this partial separation takes place. It's not complete. You might have some blood that sort of goes back here and sort of gets stuck in this heart loop right here. But once it leaves, you then have a situation where the blood can go through the bodies, the oxygen's removed, and then it goes back to the heart. And then you have deoxygenated blood being pumped out. Now again, you might have deoxygenated blood that's sort of stuck in this other loop here because it's not a complete separation. But it's a more efficient mechanism, a more effective separation than we see with the fish. With mammals, what we have is we have a complete separation. With birds, we have a complete separation. With crocodiles, we have a complete separation. So we have a complete separation between the pulmonary circuit and the systemic circuit. The pulmonary circuit is where the blood goes to the lungs and gets oxygenated. The systemic circuit is where the blood goes to the body and the oxygen is removed. But we start to see that with these reptiles. Now, there are 4 orders of reptiles that are still alive today. These are the colonia, which are the turtles and the tortoises. We have the Rhizocephalia, which are the tuataras. We're not going to talk about them because they're a very small lineage. You have the Squamata, which are the lizards and the snakes. And the Crocodilian, which are the crocodiles and the alligators. Now, all living reptiles, with the exception of the Crocodilia, are ectothermic. The Crocodilia are sort of a mix. Ectothermic means you use outside temperatures to regulate your body temperature. If it's hot outside, your body temperature is going to increase. If it's cold outside, your body temperature decreases. This is why you see lizards and snakes early in the morning sitting on a rock basking in the sun. They're trying to warm up to increase their metabolism so they can start to move around. You need to be, in order to be able to move around, you need to have a certain body temperature. Overnight, the temperature drops, so the body temperature of these reptiles drops as well. This is why if you have a terrarium with a lizard or a snake in it, what's one thing that you need? A heat lamp. You need to have a lamp that just sits there and shining on it so that the reptile can absorb the heat and increase its body temperature. There are about 7,000 different species of reptiles that are alive today. They're pretty much found worldwide. The only regions where they're not found are the extreme cold regions, and this is because of the fact that they're ectotherms. Ectotherms can't survive, for the most part, in extreme cold temperatures. It never gets warm enough for them to really warm up and become active. So let's talk about the colonia for a second. The colonia are recognized because of their shell. This is a unique structure that differentiates them from all other reptiles. Their body is encased in a protective shell. And it's actually two protective shells. They have a carapace, which is the dorsal shell that's on the top, and a plastron, which is the ventral shell on the bottom. They're not connected to each other. How many people see the old Bugs Bunny cartoons where you have the turtle and takes the shell off and that sort of thing? They can't do that. The shell is part of their structure. They're physically attached to the shell. If you see an empty shell in there, it's because the turtle or the tortoise has died. It's not because they moved on to a new shell. So they're physically attached. It's actually two shell structures that are connected to each other. Now, tortoises and turtles are separated based primarily on where they're found. Tortoises are primarily terrestrial. Turtles are primarily aquatic. So that's a simple way that you can sort of recognize whether something is a tortoise or a turtle. Both of these do not have teeth, but they do have a sharp beak. We have the herpetologist in the department, Dr. Fred Zaden. He has a huge tortoise. It's probably literally about this big at his house. If you feed that thing grass, you have to watch out because that beak will take a finger off. Not trying to eat it, but it's just eating the grass. Now, one thing that's sort of interesting is the fact that when you have marine turtles, they actually have to return to land in order for reproduction to take place. This is sort of the opposite of what we saw with amphibians, what we saw with other organisms that are sort of early terrestrial organisms. They need to return to the water. But here we have a situation with marine turtles that they are terrestrial. They evolved in a terrestrial habitat, and they went back to an aquatic habitat. But in order for reproduction to take place, they need to return to the habitat where their ancestors came from, the terrestrial habitat. So you sort of have this split of what's going on. And it has to do with this evolutionary process. The animals that need to return to the water are very early terrestrial organisms. And they need to return to the water for certain periods of their life development. The animals that return to the land are evolved from ones that were terrestrial. So they need to return to their sort of ancestral habitat. Now the squamata are recognized as are called the lizards and the snakes. These are recognized by having a paired copulatory organ in the male. And in fact, that's how you identify males from females primarily. There are some lizards where you actually see color differentiations. Certainly on all the little anoles, you've seen the males going around. What do they have to attract the females? You see them flapping their neck. It's a territorial display. It's there to attract females. It's called a dewlap. But for the most part, it's very difficult to identify males from females. So you actually have to look at the reproductive organs. You can look at them without killing them in order to identify if it's a male or female. If it's a male, they're going to have these paired reproductive structures. There are about 3,000 different species of snakes. Snakes are recognized by lacking limbs. But if you look at the bone structure of snakes, you can see in the ancestral limbs, you see bone structures that were limbs at one point. So we know that the ancestor to snakes had limbs, but over evolutionary time, they've lost them. Snakes have movable eyelids. They also have external ears. There are slightly more species of lizards, about 3,800. Many lizards have the ability to regenerate tails. Why do you think they might do this? Why would a lizard want to lose its tail? If you lose a tail, regenerate it. It's costly. It takes energy. It takes resources. What's the point of that?
To get away from predator.
It's to escape predation. If you're a predator and you grab a lizard as it's running away, what's the most likely thing you're going to grab? Your claws or beaks. Probably its tail. So if the tail can be lost, that's a way for the lizard to escape. And in fact, if you ever see a lizard lose its tail, what does the tail do? It keeps moving, it's thrashing around, keeping the attention of the predator, distracting the predator so the lizard can still get away. Now the predator gets something out of it, gets a nice tasty tail to eat. The lizard gets something out of it, it escapes alive. So it's sort of a win-win situation. Then we have the order Crocodilia. There are 20, this is a very small order. There are only 25 different species. The vast majority of these are mostly aquatic. They will return to land. They will occasionally be on land for the majority of their lifetime, but most of these are aquatic in nature. They're all carnivorous. They're all very large carnivorous animals. You have the crocodiles, which are primarily nocturnal. During the day, the crocodiles are going to be sleeping, going to be resting, going to be hiding away. They're primarily found in tropical and subtropical regions. There are only 2 species of alligators in this world. In terms of these 25 species, the vast majority of them are crocodilians. One of the species of alligators are found here in the U.S., which is why we oftentimes think about alligators. In fact, we have alligators down here in the valley. Now, the crocodile and alligator body form, the way that they sort of engage in predation, it's a stealth hunting mechanism. When they're hunting, they're sort of floating at the surface of the water. What do you actually see of them? Maybe their eyes, maybe their nostrils, but you don't see this huge 6 to 8 foot long predator. The vast majority of their body sort of remains under the surface, and if you see anything, it might look like a floating log. So they're stealth hunters. They will slowly sneak up on organisms, especially large mammals that might be getting water at the edge of the water area, and they'll get extremely close and then be able to attack. So they have adaptations to help this sort of stealth hunting ability. They have eyes that are found on the top of the head. All other reptiles, the eyes are found on the side of the head. They have nostrils that are on the top of the snout. So you can have the eyes and the nostrils sticking out of the water. This is important because they want to see what they're hunting, and they need to breathe. But everything else can remain below water. They have huge mouths. They need to be able to attack quickly and grab a hold of whatever they're hunting. And they have extremely strong necks. One of the ways that they will try and kill animals is to sort of grab it to the ground and then roll around, or grab it underwater, pull it underwater, roll around, and force it to stay underwater until it drowns. They don't kill it by tearing its jugular or something like you see with some of the hunting mammals. They basically grab it and hold it underwater. So these are the crocodilians, alligators, and reptiles. What's one way that you can identify the difference between these two? Anyone know?
No.
You look at the snout. The alligators have a very wide snout. The crocodiles have a very narrow snout. So those are the 2 sort of main distinctions there. The Crocodilia lineage, not the crocodiles, but the Crocodilia lineage, far more closely resembles the living bird lineage than they do other reptiles. And it's thought that the crocodiles are probably the closest living reptile today that's in terms of similarity to birds. They share a lot of characteristics. They both build nests and care for their young. Most reptiles, when they lay their eggs, the young are on their own. Crocodiles, the mother actually cares for the young, same thing that we see with the birds. We mentioned their improved circulatory system. They both have a 4-chambered heart. And the crocodiles, however, as I said, are still ectoplasms. So this brings us to this idea of birds. Birds, in terms of terrestrial vertebrates, so excluding the fish, birds are the most diverse of all terrestrial vertebrates. There are 28 different orders. There are 166 different families. There are over 8,000 different species. Now, if you compare that to fish with over 30,000 different species, the fish still win. If you compare that to arthropods or insects with over 1 million different species, certainly the insects still win. But as we're getting more and more narrow here, of all terrestrial vertebrates, the birds are the most diverse. And the success of the birds is thought to have been due to their ability of flight. There are a few other lineages of animals that have flight. What are some of those?
Insects.
Some insects can fly. Bats can fly, so there's some mammals that can fly. But those are all, there are always examples of some that can fly and some that cannot within those lineages. All birds evolve the ability of flight. Some of them have lost it, like the penguins and the ostriches. But the vast majority of birds still retain this ability of flight. Now, birds share a lot of characteristics with the reptiles. There's still a lot of similarities. They have the amniotic egg. This is something that evolved in reptiles. We see it in the birds. They have scales on their legs. If you look at a chicken leg or something like that, you can actually see the scales. So they share those reptilian traits. They do lack the tails that we see in reptiles. The tails of birds are specifically adapted for flight. They also lack the teeth that we see in reptiles, or in the majority of reptiles. So they've lost those characteristics. And basically there are three evolutionary features that we sort of see in birds that are novel to birds, that have separated them from the reptiles. The first of this is the evolution of the feather. The feather is a very unique structure that helps enable the process of flight. The second of this is the evolution of hollow bones. Hollow bones are absolutely required for flight. And the third novel feature is the physiological mechanisms for flight. Birds have an entirely different method of respiration. They still use lungs, they still breathe, but they have a much more efficient method of extracting as much oxygen as possible from the atmosphere. And the reason for this is because flight takes a lot of energy. It is very difficult to fly. You can't just glue feathers to your arm and start flapping your arms and hoping you can fly. How many people have ever seen those videos of the early 1900s of people trying to create all these flying machines like bicycles that had things that move like this? It's not that simple. You have to have all these adaptations in order to fly, and it takes a lot of energy. So let's talk a little bit about feathers. Feathers are modified scales. They're derived from keratin, the same structure that we see in reptile scales. So it's thought that feathers evolved from scales in reptiles. The evolution of the feather allows the bird to provide lift. Lift is simply the physical force that is going to push the organism away from the plant. But the other thing that feathers enable the organisms to do is to conserve heat. As we said, birds are endotherms. They have they're able to regulate their internal body temperature. One of the things that happens if you're an endotherm is as you're creating heat for the body, it's always radiating out. You just go and feel your arm. Well, mine doesn't actually feel that warm, but usually it'll feel a little bit warm because you're radiating heat. And so if you can have a way to conserve the heat, to keep the heat inside, that's going to be less costly in terms of regulatory action. You don't have to produce as much heat because you're conserving. The flight skeleton is the second sort of physical adaptation for flight. The bones of birds are thin and hollow. If they weren't hollow, the skeleton would simply be too heavy to lift. It would require too much energy, even with the efficient respiration, even with feathers, to be able to lift the bones. Now, many of the bird bones are actually fused for rigidity. So you have systems where you have two bones that are fused together. And the reason for this, again, is because of the physiological adaptation. Flight requires a lot of energy. It requires a lot of effort. This means you need to have extremely strong muscles. If your muscles are too strong and the bones are too flexible, they're not going to work very well. If you fuse the bones together, you can have an anchor point for an extremely strong muscle that will be able to withstand the pressure that that muscle is exerting. So you have these bones fused because of the necessary muscle size for flight. So if we look at these feathers, this is what a feather looks up close. You have these bars that sort of hold the filaments together. And as I say, these feathers evolved from reptile scales. We have an evolutionary history where we can see the evolution of feathers. There are dinosaur-like ancestors of birds that have feather-like scales, and we have the earliest bird we can see a very distinct feather. The structure of the feather allows for these linked filaments to link together. This provides a continuous flat surface. It's more efficient than just having a flat surface like we see with insect wings, because you don't have as much material you need to produce biologically. It's a little bit flexible, and that's important for wings. You don't want something that's absolutely rigid. But you still need it to be sturdy enough so as the bird is moving its wings, it will be able to provide this lift. So this is sort of the ancestor of birds. This is Archaeopteryx. This is what we would classify as the first bird. has feathers. If you look at the fossil remains, we see evidence of feathers. So since feathers is a characteristic we use to identify birds, we characterize this as a bird. If you saw this running around today, you might not think it's a bird. It doesn't look completely like one. You see sort of some remnants of digits on the wings. Looks like it's primarily running around. Looks like it still has teeth. But because of the feathers, we classify this as bird. It had a long skull with teeth. It still has a long reptilian tail, but the feathers are the identifying characteristic. It had feathers on the wings. It had feathers on the tail. Was this capable of flight? Probably not. It might be able to glide. But researchers are currently still trying to figure out why feathers evolved. There's thought that it might have evolved to conserve heat because they act as an insulator. There are thoughts that it might have evolved to act in mating displays or territorial displays. There are thoughts that they might have evolved so that the ancestors of birds could glide a little bit, be more efficient predators because they'll sort of swoop down, not actually fly, but glide from above. If we look at the forelimbs of the Archaeopteryx, we see that they're identical to those of the theropods. So this gives us evidence that the birds evolved from the theropods. Now, the primary reason I mentioned those different things, there's still a lot of hypotheses. Most people think that birds evolved because of insulation. The ideas of the mating displays or reproductive displays is a relatively recent one. The reason why they see this is because they're finding bird ancestors in areas where they think that insulation was not necessarily needed. So it's still up in the air, although most people think that it evolved due to insulation. Now, if we look at this sort of history of birds, we have an ancestral theropod, this sort of ancestral dinosaur, and birds evolved from this ancestor. We have an intermediate that has wrist bones that are very similar to the birds that we see. They have a flexible wrist bone, a flexible joint there. We see the Caudipteryx, which sort of is an ancestral bird. It's thought that it's more of an intermediate between dinosaurs and birds. It has some similar characteristics. We don't see true feathers, but we see some scales that look very much like feathers. Then we have the Archaeopteryx that we classify as a bird because of the feather structure. Archaeopteryx is no longer alive, the modern birds are. So when we talk about these adaptations for flight, I mentioned these already. You need to have efficient respiration. The way that birds enable this is they have air that passes in one direction through the lungs. What about the air in our lungs? How does that pass? One direction? 2 directions? 5 directions? 10 directions? 2? Everyone breathe in. Breathe out. What direction does the air go in? Going in, going out. 2 directions. Birds have air that flows one direction. It passes across the lungs in one direction. How does this work? Well, what they have is they actually have a secondary organ inside their body where the air passes across the lungs into this secondary structure. Then when it's ready to be exhaled, it's exhaled separately. So rather than having one breath where they inhale and exhale at the same time, you have this unidirectional flow of air, meaning you can extract more oxygen from the air and it's more efficient. You have more efficient circulation. You see a 4-chambered heart in the birds. 4-chambered heart means that you can more efficiently pump the oxygen to muscles, and this is going to be important because the muscles are using the oxygen for respiration to produce ATP. They also have an extremely rapid heartbeat. How many people have ever held a bird? Small bird, large bird, something like that. Have you felt the heart? It feels like it's going a mile a minute. This is not because it's scared of you. It is scared of you, but its heart is not beating that way because it's scared of you. It has a very rapid heartbeat to improve the speed at which oxygen is flowing to the muscles. And then the last adaptation that we see is endothermy. This idea that you have an internal body temperature. A high body temperature allows for increased metabolic activity. It allows the muscles and the heart to work faster. And if you think about it sort of just in a purely physical sense, what do we see reptiles doing in the morning?
Laying out the sun.
laying out, fasting, absorbing heat. If birds had to do that, and they couldn't fly until they reached a certain temperature, and they had to absorb that heat from the surrounding environment, flight would not nearly be as effective as it is right now. Birds can fly no matter what because of this endotherm. So I mentioned that birds are the most diverse. Most ancient birds are flightless. The ostrich is considered an ancient ancestral sort of form of a bird. There are some modern birds. Keep it down there. Come on. Seriously. There are some modern birds that have lost the ability to flight, like penguins, but the vast majority of birds are able to engage in flight. In terms of evolutionary history, the ancient birds are considered more like the ostrich. You have the next lineages that sort of evolved are things like the waterfowl, the ducks, and the geese. But the majority of birds alive today are the passerines. These are the songbirds, the common birds that we see around. And so those are about 60% of the birds that are alive. So now we'll talk about mammals on Monday. Please do not forget that there is no class on Friday. If you are interested in an HHMI, you can come see me now, but make sure you come see me sometime.